Hey guys, tonight we begin with old maps. Very old maps. Maps drawn by exhausted sailors, suspicious monks, royal bureaucrats, and deeply sleep-deprived men staring at coastlines for 6 months straight while surviving mostly on salted fish and regret. So dim the lights a little. Maybe grab a blanket. Maybe pretend you are aboard a damp Ottoman ship somewhere in the Atlantic in the early 1500s, listening to waves slap against wood while a navigator quietly insists he definitely knows where Brazil is, even though he absolutely does not. Tonight's story is about unexplained ancient maps. The mysterious ones. The maps people stare at on the internet at 3 in the morning before announcing that medieval sailors discovered Antarctica, Atlantis, aliens, or perhaps all 3 simultaneously. And honestly, ancient maps are wonderful for this sort of thing because they combine 2 very human qualities: confidence and incomplete information, which is, if we are being fair, also the foundation of most royal marriages throughout history. Now, the most famous of these mysterious maps is probably the map made by Piri Reis, an Ottoman admiral, a navigator, a pirate, technically, because during this period, the line between admiral and pirate was often mostly a matter of paperwork. And Piri Reis lived during a time when the world was expanding very quickly in the minds of Europeans and Ottomans alike. New coastlines were appearing constantly, new trade routes, new islands, new opportunities to get violently lost. The early 16th century was an age of maps. Everyone wanted them. Kings wanted them for empire. Merchants wanted them for profit. Explorers wanted them so they could stop accidentally sailing into swamps. And mapmakers, naturally, became extremely important people despite frequently working from information that sounded like this. Yes, Captain. And then after the giant bird island, you turn left at the angry current. Very scientific. The famous Piri Reis Map was created in 1513, or at least the surviving fragment was, because only part of the map still exists today, which somehow makes it even more mysterious. Human beings love fragments. The less complete something is, the more convinced we become that it contains infinite secrets. This surviving piece shows parts of Europe, Africa, and the Americas. And ever since its rediscovery in the 20th century, people have stared at it with increasingly dramatic expressions. Because some claim it shows Antarctica. Not just Antarctica. Antarctica without ice, which would be difficult, considering Antarctica was officially discovered by Europeans centuries later. Now, before we drift into conspiracy territory with the confidence of a man building a submarine in his garage, let's float gently into who Piri Reis actually was. He was born around 1470 in the Ottoman Empire, likely in Gallipoli, a naval town, which meant he basically grew up around ships, sailors shouting, ropes, and the smell of damp wood. His uncle was the famous corsair Kemal Reis, and young Piri spent years sailing with him around the Mediterranean. This sounds adventurous, and it was, but also deeply unpleasant. Mediterranean naval life involved storms, disease, cramped sleeping conditions, food of mysterious texture, and endless arguments about navigation, which, to be fair, is still true of boats. Piri Reis absorbed knowledge constantly. He learned coastlines, harbors, currents, trade routes, and most importantly, he learned information from other sailors. Because maps in this era were often collaborative, a patchwork of rumors and copied charts, a giant geographical group project stretching across centuries. And like all group projects, some people clearly did not do the reading. Now, Piri himself explained where he got his information. This is important, because conspiracy theories often behave as though the map simply descended from heaven one afternoon. But Piri literally wrote notes on it. He explained that he used around 20 source maps and charts. Some ancient, some contemporary, some Portuguese, some Arabic, and allegedly one connected to Christopher Columbus himself, which already tells us something fascinating. Knowledge in the early modern world was moving constantly between cultures. Ottoman sailors used European charts. Europeans used Arab navigational knowledge. Everyone copied everyone else. And occasionally someone added sea monsters for decoration because medieval cartographers truly understood branding. Now, let us gently drift toward the central mystery. The southern portion of the Piri Reis Map appears strange. Some people interpret it as the coast of Antarctica. Others say it is simply a distorted South America. And honestly, distortions were extremely common. Early maps stretched things, bent coastlines, compressed distances, made islands enormous, forgot entire continents, sometimes because of bad information. Sometimes because map projections are genuinely difficult, and sometimes because a sailor had not slept properly in 8 months. But during the 20th century, several writers became fascinated with the map, especially after it was rediscovered in 1929 in Istanbul's Topkapi Palace, which is exactly the kind of rediscovery historians love. Dusty palace archive. Forgotten document. Scholars dramatically leaning over tables. Very cinematic. Though in reality it probably involved paperwork and someone sneezing. One of the strongest pushes for the Antarctica theory came decades later when writers began suggesting the map showed Queen Maud Land beneath the Antarctic ice sheet. This sounds impressive immediately, and many documentaries became very excited. Ancient civilization, lost knowledge, prehistoric mapping technology. At this point, someone in television production is usually whispering, "Can we add ominous music?" But there are problems. Several very large problems. For one thing, Antarctica beneath the ice was not perfectly known even in modern times. And the supposed match between the map and Antarctica often requires a tremendous amount of imaginative squinting. The coastlines do not align cleanly. The projections are inconsistent. And many historians argue the southern landmass is simply an extension of South America drawn incorrectly, which was common, because accurate longitude measurement at sea was brutally difficult before reliable marine chronometers. Basically, sailors knew latitude reasonably well. Longitude was where things became emotionally complicated. Entire ships vanished because of longitude problems. Imagine attempting to map an entire planet with partial information storm damage, and one navigator named Yusuf insisting he recognizes the coastline, even though he absolutely does not. So while the Piri Reis Map is genuinely fascinating, historians generally do not see it as proof of ancient Antarctic civilizations. Sorry to disappoint Atlantis enthusiasts. Though, honestly, Atlantis people are never truly disappointed. They simply relocate Atlantis somewhere else. Now, another thing worth mentioning is that medieval and early modern maps were not always intended to be scientifically precise in the modern sense. Some were practical navigation tools. Others were prestige objects, political symbols, demonstrations of power. Kings loved giant maps because they made them feel in control of lands they had often never visited. There is something deeply royal about standing in front of a huge map confidently discussing territories while peasants nearby are eating turnips in the rain. And map makers frequently included artistic flourishes. Sea monsters, mythical creatures, tiny ships, wind gods blowing air from clouds, which honestly sounds much nicer than modern GPS systems calmly informing you to drive into a lake. Now, one beautiful thing about ancient maps is how they reveal human imagination. People filled unknown spaces with possibilities. Sometimes monsters, sometimes paradise, sometimes kingdoms of gold. And occasionally Christian Europe became obsessed with the legendary figure known as Prester John. Of course they did. Prester John was supposedly a powerful Christian king somewhere in the East or Africa, depending on the century and who was currently guessing. European rulers desperately wanted him to exist because they hoped for an ally against Islamic powers. So maps began including imaginary kingdoms associated with him. An entire geopolitical fantasy appearing on parchment because medieval rulers collectively decided optimism was a strategy. And honestly, maps did this constantly. Cartographers added places based on rumor. Sometimes islands appeared for centuries before sailors realized they did not exist. Imagine being a sailor searching for a fake island because a cartographer in Venice trusted a guy named Marco who once got drunk in Madeira. This happened more often than you would think. One famous phantom island was Hy Brasil, a mythical island west of Ireland. It appeared on maps for hundreds of years. Hundreds. Entire generations accepted this island as real despite nobody reliably finding it, which is honestly comforting. Humanity has always enjoyed misinformation. The internet merely accelerated the process. Now, while Europe was busy imagining islands, the Ottoman world was building sophisticated navigational traditions of its own. Piri Reis eventually wrote a famous navigational book called the Kitab-i-Bari, the Book of Navigation. And unlike sensational television documentaries, this work was deeply practical. It included coastal descriptions, ports, hazards, currents, real sailor information, because most navigators were less concerned with ancient mysteries and more concerned with not crashing into rocks. A surprisingly timeless human goal. Piri Reis himself eventually rose high in Ottoman naval service. But like many capable historical figures, his life ended unpleasantly. He was executed in 1553 because imperial politics have always been relaxing and reasonable. Officially, He was blamed after a military failure in the Persian Gulf, though age and court rivalries probably mattered too. And there is something strangely fitting about a great navigator dying not from storms or shipwrecks, but from bureaucracy, the true eternal force of history. Now, let's gently sail away from the Ottomans for a moment and drift toward another mysterious mapmaker whose work caused endless speculation. Because of course one unexplained map was not enough for humanity. No, we needed several. So now we arrive at the strange and beautiful world of medieval mappa mundi. World maps. Or at least what medieval Europeans imagined world maps should look like. And some of them are absolutely delightful. The famous Hereford Mappa Mundi, for instance, is less a navigation tool and more a giant illustrated encyclopedia of medieval beliefs. Jerusalem sits at the center. Asia is placed at the top. Biblical events appear everywhere. And around the edges, naturally, are monsters. Because medieval people truly believed unexplored regions probably contained dog-headed men, which honestly feels unfair to dogs. These maps reflected worldview more than geography, religion, mythology, classical knowledge. Reality was only one ingredient in the soup. And this is important because modern viewers sometimes misunderstand ancient maps completely. We expect scientific precision, GPS accuracy, measured coastlines. But many historical maps were trying to explain meaning rather than provide exact coordinates. The world was moralized, symbolic. A map could simultaneously describe geography, theology, politics, and rumor, which sounds confusing, because it was. Now, one persistent mystery in ancient cartography involves how knowledge survived across centuries. Because pieces of ancient Greek geographical knowledge genuinely were preserved. Figures like Claudius Ptolemy created influential geographical systems in antiquity. His work survived through Byzantine and Islamic scholarship before re-entering Western Europe. And when Renaissance Europeans rediscovered classical geography, they treated it almost like treasure. Ancient coordinates, ancient projections. Of course, sometimes the ancient information was wrong, but that rarely stopped anyone. People love old authority. If an ancient scholar confidently announced something in 150 AD, someone in 1500 often responded, "Well, he certainly sounds educated." And honestly, this habit never fully disappeared. Now, perhaps the strangest thing about unexplained maps is how emotionally attached people become to them. Because maps suggest hidden knowledge, secret civilizations, lost explorers, forgotten wisdom. And humans adore the idea that history contains giant concealed truths waiting patiently for discovery. Preferably truths involving Atlantis. Always Atlantis. Poor Atlantis has become the historical equivalent of a spare puzzle piece people force into every mystery. Ancient structure? Atlantis. Odd map? Atlantis. Strange coastline? Very likely Atlantis. At this point, Atlantis has better representation in documentaries than several real civilizations. And yet the genuine history of cartography is already fascinating without needing lost super civilizations. Think about what these map makers accomplished. They stitched together fragments from sailors speaking different languages across enormous distances. They tried to describe a planet they could never fully see. No satellites, no aircraft, no accurate clocks for longitude, just observation, mathematics, stories, and astonishing amounts of confidence. Which brings us back, very softly, to Piri Reis, a man standing at the crossroads of worlds. Ottoman, Mediterranean, Atlantic, collecting information from explorers, merchants, and navigators, trying to turn chaos into shape. And perhaps that is why the map still fascinates people. Not because it proves impossible ancient technology, but because it captures humanity during a moment when the world suddenly felt much larger than anyone expected. And everyone was trying desperately to draw it before someone else did, which is honestly a very human panic. And as the candles burn low in some Ottoman study, and sailors somewhere argue quietly over coastlines they barely understand, we can slowly drift onward toward even stranger maps. Because naturally, the story only becomes more peculiar from here. So the candles continue flickering softly across the table. Ink dries slowly on stretched parchment. A navigator somewhere is insisting that yes, he absolutely discovered a new island, and no, he definitely was not delirious from dehydration at the time. And unfortunately for future historians, people believed him. Because tonight we continue drifting through the strange world of unexplained ancient maps. A world filled with phantom islands, impossible coastlines, wandering continents, and cartographers who occasionally treated rumor with the same seriousness modern people reserve for satellite imagery, which is honestly impressive. Now, one of the great recurring themes in map history is that humans hate empty spaces. We really do. If there is a blank patch on a map, somebody eventually fills it with something. A sea monster, a mountain range, a golden kingdom, a tribe of giant one-legged people. Because apparently medieval imagination operated with very little supervision. And in fairness, unexplored regions were genuinely mysterious to many people. Travel was dangerous. Communication was slow. A sailor could return from a voyage and describe almost anything, especially if he spoke confidently enough, which many sailors did. Confidence has always been humanity's preferred substitute for evidence. Now, among the most persistent map mysteries were phantom islands. Entire land masses that appeared on maps for centuries despite not existing. Not tiny mistakes either. Some were major geographical features. Named, illustrated, repeated by respected cartographers. Imagine accidentally inventing a whole island and having society accept it for 400 years. That is legacy. One famous example was the island of Antillia, sometimes called the Isle of Seven Cities, which already sounds suspiciously dramatic. According to legend, 7 bishops fled Muslim conquest in Iberia centuries earlier and sailed west into the Atlantic, where they founded magnificent cities on a distant island. Naturally, cartographers became obsessed, because medieval Europe loved 3 things deeply: religious legends, faraway islands, and optimistic misunderstandings of geography. Antillia appeared on numerous 15th century maps. A large rectangular island floating in the Atlantic, like it had an appointment there. Some explorers genuinely hoped to find it. And this is one of the charming things about pre-modern exploration. People sailed enormous distances chasing rumors with astonishing sincerity. Meanwhile, life aboard ship remained profoundly uncomfortable. Tiny sleeping quarters, rotting food, questionable drinking water, and absolutely catastrophic hygiene. But yes, by all means, let us spend 6 months searching for the magic Bishop Island. Now, interestingly, Phantom Islands sometimes emerged from real navigational errors. A sailor might miscalculate position, mistake fog for land, see volcanic activity, or encounter unusual cloud formations. And once an island entered cartographic tradition, removing it became surprisingly difficult, because mapmakers copied earlier maps constantly. One cartographer copied another, who copied another, who copied a sailor's story from 80 years earlier. It was basically medieval repost culture. And this meant errors could survive for generations. A perfect example is the famous island of California. Yes, California itself. For a period during the 17th century, many European maps depicted California as an island entirely separated from mainland North America. An enormous geographical mistake casually drifting around atlases for decades, which somehow feels appropriate for California specifically. The error likely emerged from misunderstood exploration reports and was reinforced through repeated copying. And once influential maps showed island California, others followed. Because cartographers, like everyone else in history, occasionally preferred consensus over verification. Now, let us gently float farther north into one of the most famous, mysterious islands ever placed on maps. Hy-Brasil, a legendary island west of Ireland said to appear only occasionally through mist. Very atmospheric. Irish folklore described it as hidden most of the time, visible only once every 7 years in some versions, which is convenient for an island nobody could locate consistently. Reports of sightings persisted for centuries. Sailors claimed to see it. Maps included it. Expeditions searched for it. At one point it appeared so often in maps that many accepted it as unquestionably real. Imagine dedicating your naval career to finding Brigadoon. Now some historians think Hy-Brasil myths may have been inspired by real Atlantic phenomena. Fog banks, optical illusions, perhaps distant glimpses of actual land, or simply stories evolving over generations until imagination took control, which humans are exceptionally good at, especially near oceans. The sea encourages exaggeration. Something about endless water convinces people they saw impossible things. And honestly, after months at sea surviving on hard biscuits and stale beer, many sailors probably would have believed the moon itself was following them personally. Now another fascinating mystery map is the Vinland map. And this one caused enormous controversy. The Vinland map supposedly showed part of North America before Columbus, which immediately attracted global attention because humans adore historical upsets. The idea that Vikings reached North America before Columbus is of course historically true, We know Norse explorers reached areas like Newfoundland around the year 1000. Leif Erikson and other Norse voyagers genuinely crossed the Atlantic centuries before Columbus. Though medieval Europe largely failed to capitalize on this because long-distance communication and documentation were inconsistent. Also because medieval politics constantly resembled a collapsing dinner party. But the Vinland map appeared to offer dramatic cartographic evidence. Discovered in the 20th century, it was presented as a 15th century map showing Vinland west of Greenland. Scholars argued endlessly about it. Ink analysis, parchment dating, linguistic clues. Academic debates became extremely heated, which is always slightly funny because historians sound calm while essentially engaging in intellectual knife fights. And eventually many experts concluded the map was likely a forgery. A very sophisticated forgery, but still a forgery, which somehow made the story even stranger. Imagine forging an ancient map so convincingly that scholars spend decades arguing over it internationally. That requires commitment, and perhaps too much free time. Now, throughout all of this, maps remained deeply political objects. Kings sponsored map-making not merely for curiosity, but for power. Control the map, and you shaped perception. Colonial claims often depended on cartography. Borders emerged from lines drawn by people who had never visited the places involved, which explains a remarkable amount of world history, honestly. European empires especially became obsessed with mapping during the Age of Exploration. Spain, Portugal, England, France, all racing to chart coastlines and claim territory. And many of these early maps mixed careful observation with extraordinary guesswork. One coastline might be highly accurate while the neighboring region dissolved into fantasy. A beautifully detailed harbor could sit beside giant imaginary mountains. Accuracy existed in patches, like medieval internet coverage. Now perhaps no map better captures the blend of precision and fantasy than the works of Gerardus Mercator. Mercator, whose projection still influences maps today, was a brilliant cartographer of the 16th century. But even he worked within a world where uncertainty remained enormous. His famous world maps included speculative northern regions and mysterious polar geography, because the Arctic was still deeply unknown. And unknown places attracted theories the way abandoned castles attract ghost stories. Some believed the North Pole contained a giant magnetic mountain. Others imagined strange civilizations. At various times, maps included rivers no one could find, mountain ranges that did not exist, and inland seas that turned out to be entirely imaginary. The world looked half-known, which in many ways it was. Now, one especially strange feature appearing on some ancient maps was Terra Australis, the great southern continent. Cartographers believe there must be a massive southern landmass balancing the continents of the north, because symmetry felt philosophically satisfying. This was not entirely irrational by historical standards. Ancient and medieval thinkers often assumed nature favored balance. So if Europe, Asia, and Africa occupied much of the northern hemisphere, surely something enormous existed below. And thus maps featured vast southern continents long before Australia or Antarctica were properly understood. Some versions stretched absurdly far across the globe. An entire imaginary megacontinent politely occupying empty space because scholars disliked asymmetry. And honestly, there is something weirdly relatable about this. Humans often invent answers simply because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. Blank spaces itch psychologically, which is why mysterious maps continue attracting conspiracy theories today. People see ambiguity and immediately begin constructing narratives. Ancient advanced civilizations, lost technologies, secret global empires. Because admitting people were figuring things out gradually with imperfect information feels less dramatic, even though it is true. And honestly, real historical exploration was already bizarre enough. Take Christopher Columbus himself. Columbus famously underestimated Earth's circumference significantly. He believed Asia was much closer westward than it actually was, which means one of history's most consequential voyages partially succeeded because of incorrect math, a deeply human achievement. And many explorers after him continued making errors. Coastlines stretched strangely. Distances became distorted. Entire regions floated in the wrong place. Maps improved gradually through accumulation, not sudden revelation. Thousands of observations layered together over centuries, which makes the achievement more impressive, not less. Now, let us drift softly toward another mysterious cartographic obsession: sea monsters. Because if you examine many medieval and Renaissance maps, oceans appear absolutely crowded with horrifying creatures. Whales, serpents, dragon-like beasts. Sometimes giant fish are shown attacking ships with dramatic enthusiasm. And while some monsters reflected mythological traditions, others may have originated from distorted sightings of real animals. A walrus seen briefly in fog can apparently inspire tremendous artistic creativity, especially if the observer has not slept well. Mapmakers also used monsters decoratively. Empty ocean spaces looked dull, and wealthy patrons preferred elaborate illustrations. A map was partly a luxury object, which meant artists could become wonderfully theatrical. One cartographer might carefully calculate latitude, while another nearby painted a sea serpent eating sailors. A balanced workplace environment. Now, the fascinating thing is that future generations often misunderstand these artistic additions. Modern viewers sometimes assume mapmakers literally believed every creature they drew. But symbolism, decoration, and storytelling all played roles. Ancient maps were not purely scientific documents. They were cultural artifacts. And perhaps nowhere is this clearer than in medieval maps centered around Jerusalem. Many European world maps place Jerusalem at the literal center of the world, not because survey measurements demanded it, but because theology did. Spiritual importance shaped geography. And this reminds us again that maps tell us as much about the people making them as about the world itself. A medieval monk, an Ottoman admiral, and a Portuguese navigator might all map the same coastline differently because they understood the world differently. Maps reflected worldview, fear, religion, politics, ambition, and occasionally wild optimism. Now, as centuries passed, navigation improved slowly. Astronomical measurements became more refined. Instruments improved. Global exploration expanded. But even by the 17th century, enormous uncertainties remained. The Pacific Ocean especially tormented mapmakers. Its sheer size created confusion everywhere. Islands appeared and disappeared constantly in European reports. Some were mapped repeatedly before vanishing from later charts. Others were rediscovered multiple times because sailors failed to realize somebody else had already named them differently. Humanity has always enjoyed duplicating paperwork internationally. Now, perhaps the most beautiful aspect of these mysterious maps is that they preserve the emotional experience of uncertainty. Today, most people carry precise global maps in their pockets. A phone can locate your position within meters while simultaneously recommending nearby coffee, which would have seemed supernatural to Renaissance navigators. But ancient mapmakers lived in a world where vast regions remained uncertain shadows. And they tried anyway. They drew coastlines from fragments, filled gaps with stories, balanced observation with imagination. Sometimes they were wrong magnificently, but there is something comforting about that, because history was not created by all-knowing geniuses calmly understanding the planet. It was created by tired humans making educated guesses while floating on dangerous water. And as another phantom island fades quietly into Atlantic mist, and another cartographer carefully copies an error that will survive for 200 years, we can continue drifting onward through the strange geography of the past, toward maps that claimed impossible knowledge, and explorers who were somehow both brilliant and catastrophically mistaken at exactly the same time. By now the sea air has become pleasantly cold. The candles are burning lower. Somewhere on a creaking ship, a navigator is squinting at stars through clouds while pretending this is all going according to plan. It is not, but that has never stopped humanity before. Tonight we continue wandering through the peculiar world of unexplained ancient maps. A world where coastlines blur into speculation, where forgotten continents drift across parchment, and where modern conspiracy theories quietly attach themselves to old cartography like barnacles on a ship hull. And honestly, ancient maps are perfect for conspiracy theories because they contain just enough truth to make the impossible sound briefly reasonable. A distorted coastline here, an unusual island there. A cryptic note written in faded ink by somebody named Giovanni, who probably smelled strongly of fish. Suddenly people are discussing ancient lost civilizations with enormous confidence. Now, perhaps no subject attracts more cartographic obsession than Antarctica. Specifically the idea that ancient people somehow mapped Antarctica long before modern discovery. And naturally the Piri Reis Map became central to this fascination. Because once 20th century writers suggested the map depicted Antarctica beneath its ice sheet, the theory developed a life of its own. Books appeared. Documentaries followed. Television narrators began speaking in very serious voices. Could ancient civilizations have possessed advanced knowledge, now lost to history? At which point somebody dramatically zooms into a coastline while ominous music plays. Now, the most influential popularizer of these theories was probably Charles Hapgood. Hapgood proposed that certain ancient maps preserve knowledge from a highly advanced prehistoric civilization. A civilization capable of accurately mapping the globe, including Antarctica. This was an exciting idea. People love exciting ideas. especially ideas involving forgotten wisdom, because modern society secretly enjoys imagining ancient people as mysterious supergeniuses, possibly wearing robes. Hapgood's theories even attracted attention from Albert Einstein, who corresponded with him politely. And people often mention this as though Einstein personally endorsed every conclusion. He did not. Scientists frequently correspond with unconventional thinkers without immediately declaring Atlantis real. Still, the association added prestige. Now the problem is that the evidence itself remains extremely weak. The supposed Antarctic coastline on the Piri Reis Map does not align convincingly enough for most historians, geographers, or cartographic experts. The shapes require generous interpretation, and map distortions can easily explain similarities, which sounds less thrilling than ice-free Antarctica mapped by ancient civilization, but is generally how history works. Much of historical scholarship involves experts patiently explaining why exciting theories are probably misunderstandings. A difficult profession emotionally. Now, another major issue is chronology. Antarctica's ice sheets have existed for a very long time. Far longer than human civilizations capable of global cartography. And while Earth's climate has shifted over millennia, the notion that some forgotten civilization mapped the Antarctic coast tens of thousands of years ago creates enormous archaeological problems. Mainly because such a civilization would presumably leave evidence elsewhere too. Cities. Infrastructure. Artifacts. You cannot casually map continents while leaving behind absolutely nothing except one vaguely suggestive coastline. Civilizations tend to generate clutter. Just look at the Romans. They left roads, walls, aqueducts, coins, forts, pottery, temples, and endless administrative paperwork. Empires adore paperwork. A truly advanced global civilization would leave even more traces. But despite this, the mysterious Antarctica theory remains extremely popular because it taps into a very old human dream. The belief that forgotten knowledge once existed. That ancient people knew secrets modern humanity lost. And honestly, this idea appears constantly throughout history. Medieval scholars imagined ancient wisdom hidden in lost libraries. Renaissance thinkers searched obsessively for secret classical texts. Victorian occultists became convinced Egypt concealed cosmic mysteries. Human beings have always suspected somebody else possessed the real answers. Preferably long ago, and very far away. Now, speaking of ancient mystery obsessions, we should gently float over to Atlantis. Of course we should. Atlantis appears eventually in almost every historical mystery discussion the way raccoons eventually appear near unattended garbage. The legend originates with Plato, who described Atlantis in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias. According to Plato, Atlantis was a powerful island civilization destroyed by catastrophe. And ever since then, humanity has collectively lost its mind about it. People have placed Atlantis everywhere. The Atlantic Ocean, the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, Antarctica, the Sahara Desert. At this point, Atlantis has relocated more often than medieval royal courts during plague outbreaks. Now, importantly, Many scholars believe Plato intended Atlantis primarily as a philosophical allegory, a moral and political story. But humans are astonishingly resistant to treating mysterious island civilizations metaphorically. We desperately want them to be real, especially if maps are involved. And over centuries, various cartographic oddities became linked to Atlantis theories. Phantom islands, submerged lands, strange coastlines. Every ambiguous map feature eventually attracted someone saying, "Perhaps this is evidence of Atlantis." Usually in a documentary narrated with unnecessary intensity. Now the irony is that genuine ancient geography was already fascinating enough without adding mythical supercivilizations. Take the Greeks themselves. Ancient Greek geographers accomplished extraordinary things using limited tools. Eratosthenes calculated Earth's circumference surprisingly accurately over 2,000 years ago, using shadows. Just shadows. Which honestly feels rude. Modern people need satellites and apps to navigate grocery stores, while Eratosthenes quietly estimated planetary dimensions with sticks and geometry. Ancient scholars also understood Earth was spherical centuries before medieval Europe, despite popular myths suggesting otherwise. Educated people in many ancient and medieval cultures absolutely knew Earth was round. The real challenge was scale, distance, longitude, oceanic navigation, and unfortunately oceans are enormous, very inconsiderate of them. Now, let us drift softly toward another cartographic mystery, the portal on charts. These medieval nautical maps appeared around the Mediterranean during the 13th century and afterward, and they were astonishingly accurate for coastlines. Really astonishing. Compared to symbolic medieval world maps, portal on charts suddenly look modern. Precise harbors, compass lines, detailed shores. Historians still debate exactly how such accuracy developed so rapidly, though not because aliens taught sailors geometry. Usually, more likely, generations of accumulated navigational practice gradually improved chart-making until the results suddenly became impressive. Humans often mistake gradual improvement for mysterious leaps because we only notice the moment quality becomes undeniable. Now, portal on charts worked especially well for the Mediterranean because sailors traveled those routes constantly. Repeated voyages refine knowledge over time. This is important. Accuracy comes from repetition. Mapmakers improved where ships traveled often. Remote regions remained vague much longer, which explains why Europe could map Mediterranean ports carefully while simultaneously imagining giant southern continents elsewhere. Knowledge was uneven, patchy. One coastline could be exquisitely detailed while nearby regions dissolved into decorative uncertainty. And, honestly, modern internet maps occasionally behave similarly. Now, another famous unexplained map is the Orance Fine World Map from 1531. This French map includes a massive southern continent resembling Antarctica. Naturally, mystery enthusiasts became excited immediately. But again, the explanation is probably simpler. Cartographers already expected a southern landmass, conceptually. Terra Australis had become embedded in geographical thinking. So maps included southern continents partly because scholars assumed they should exist. And eventually, of course, Antarctica really did exist, which accidentally made some earlier speculative maps appear prophetic. History occasionally rewards lucky guesses, not always intentionally. Now, perhaps the strangest thing about unexplained maps is how they reveal changing human relationships with uncertainty. Ancient and medieval people often accepted ambiguity more comfortably than modern audiences expect. A map could contain known coastlines alongside speculative regions without causing intellectual crisis. Nobody demanded perfect precision everywhere simultaneously. But modern viewers often approach ancient maps expecting hidden secrets. If something looks inaccurate, we suspect concealment rather than limitation. Because modern culture trains people to assume maps are objective and exact. GPS has spoiled us terribly. Today, if a digital map places a restaurant 2 buildings away from reality, people become furious. Meanwhile, 16th century navigators cheerfully crossed oceans using charts that occasionally misplaced entire islands.
Different standards emotionally.
Now let us gently sail toward perhaps the most persistent cartographic misunderstanding of all. The belief that ancient maps prove impossible ancient travel. Some enthusiasts argue ancient civilizations must have possessed advanced global exploration networks far beyond accepted history. And, to be fair, ancient trade networks were genuinely extensive. Phoenicians traveled widely. Polynesian navigators crossed immense Pacific distances. Arab merchants connected continents. Chinese fleets reached enormous scale under Zheng He. Human mobility in the past is often underestimated, but extraordinary claims still require evidence. And most mysterious map theories rely heavily on interpretation rather than direct proof. A coastline vaguely resembles another coastline. An island appears unexpectedly. A note seems cryptic. Then speculation expands rapidly. Humans are excellent at pattern recognition, possibly too excellent. We connect dots instinctively even when dots are unrelated, especially late at night. Especially while watching documentaries. Now, one thing often overlooked is how collaborative ancient cartography truly was. Knowledge moved across cultures continuously. Islamic scholars preserved and expanded classical geography. European sailors learned from Arab navigation. Asian trade routes transmitted information gradually across enormous regions. Maps evolved through cultural exchange, not isolated genius. And this is one reason Piri Reis matters historically even without Antarctica theories. His map reflects a connected world. Ottoman knowledge absorbing Iberian exploration. Mediterranean traditions intersecting Atlantic discoveries. A global conversation emerging slowly through trade and conquest. And naturally also through espionage because states have always stolen maps from one another enthusiastically. Nothing says international respect quite like secretly copying someone else's navigation charts. Now there is another emotional reason mysterious maps endure. They preserve wonder. Modern geography feels finished, measured,
scanned,
satellite mapped. But ancient maps remind us that the world once contained enormous unknowns. Blank spaces genuinely existed, and humans filled them with imagination. Monsters, paradises, hidden kingdoms, or occasionally just coastlines drawn slightly sideways by exhausted sailors. And perhaps that is why these maps remain so hypnotic. Not because they prove impossible secrets, but because they capture humanity midway through understanding the planet. A species attempting to draw a world larger than its current knowledge, which is oddly beautiful. And as another strange coastline curls softly across faded parchment, and another cartographer carefully sketches a continent nobody fully understands yet, we drift onward through the uncertain geography of history, toward royal map rooms, wandering explorers, and civilizations quietly arguing about the shape of the world while standing on it. Somewhere tonight, in a palace lit by candles and expensive insecurity, a king is standing over a giant table staring at a map he barely understands. He nods gravely at coastlines, points confidently at islands, pretends to know where Sumatra is, and nearby, exhausted cartographers silently pray he does not ask questions, because royal courts loved maps, absolutely adored them. Large maps especially. The bigger the map, the more powerful a ruler felt. It suggested control, knowledge, destiny. Even when the actual situation involved half the Royal Navy being lost somewhere near Madagascar. Tonight we continue drifting through unexplained ancient maps and the wonderfully strange people who created, owned, misunderstood, copied, and occasionally weaponized them. And perhaps nowhere did maps become more emotionally important than in royal courts during the Age of Exploration. Because by the 16th century, geography had become political theater. Empires were expanding. Trade routes mattered enormously. And monarchs suddenly realized the world was larger, wealthier, and more complicated than previously imagined. This realization produced two immediate responses: aggressive colonization and an unbelievable quantity of paperwork. Now the Portuguese were among the earliest masters of maritime cartography. Portugal was relatively small, but strategically positioned along the Atlantic coast. And under figures like Prince Henry the Navigator, Portuguese exploration accelerated steadily during the 15th century. Now, interestingly, Prince Henry himself was not constantly sailing around heroically discovering things. He mostly sponsored voyages and organized information, which honestly is very royal behavior. Delegation with branding. Still, the Portuguese became extraordinarily skilled navigators. They mapped African coastlines gradually, established trading posts, refined sailing techniques, and crucially, they guarded their maps obsessively, because maps were valuable state secrets. An accurate chart could mean trade dominance, military advantage, enormous wealth, which meant espionage became constant. European powers stole maps from one another continuously. Diplomats bribed cartographers. Merchants smuggled charts. Captains copied navigation routes secretly. The Renaissance occasionally resembled an international plagiarism competition with cannons. Now, one famous Portuguese mapmaker was Diogo Ribeiro, who later worked for Spain. Because talented experts in this era often changed employers depending on politics, opportunity, or which kingdom currently offered fewer chances of execution. A practical career consideration historically. Ribeiro's maps were remarkably sophisticated for the early 16th century, and looking at them today feels strangely modern. Coastlines begin stabilizing. Continents become recognizable. Humanity is slowly taming uncertainty. Very slowly. Painfully slowly. Now, despite these improvements, major mysteries remained everywhere. Take Australia. For centuries, Europeans suspected a southern continent existed long before properly mapping Australia itself. And various maps included speculative landmasses stretching across the southern hemisphere under names like Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land, which sounds dramatic because cartographers understood marketing instinctively. Now these southern continents often appeared enormous, absurdly enormous. One map might show a giant landmass nearly connecting South America to Asia. Another would casually place sprawling coastlines across empty ocean. Accuracy remained flexible, but this flexibility reflected real intellectual traditions. Many scholars genuinely believed Earth required balance. Northern continents implied southern continents. Symmetry felt philosophically correct. Nature, they assumed, would not distribute land unevenly, which is oddly wholesome. Scientifically questionable, perhaps, but emotionally tidy. Now, eventually explorers did encounter Australia, though early European understanding of it remained fragmented. Dutch sailors charted portions of the coast during the 17th century, often accidentally, which is one of history's recurring themes. Important discoveries happening because somebody got blown off course during terrible weather. And honestly, much exploration before modern navigation involved controlled confusion. Ships drifted. Storms intervened. Currents redirected voyages. Then sailors returned home trying to explain coastlines from memory while malnourished. Not ideal scientific conditions. Now, another fascinating feature of ancient maps was the persistent appearance of inland seas and rivers that did not exist. Mapmakers loved hypothetical waterways, especially routes promising convenient access to Asia. Europeans became obsessed with finding shortcuts to wealth, preferably shortcuts requiring minimal effort. The Northwest Passage became particularly seductive, a theoretical sea route through North America connecting the Atlantic and Pacific. And while such routes partially exist in Arctic regions, centuries of explorers wildly underestimated how unpleasant Arctic navigation might be. Men froze. Ships vanished. Entire expeditions dissolved into icy despair. But maps continued suggesting possibilities optimistically, because hope is apparently immortal. Now, perhaps the most haunting map-related story involves the Franklin expedition. Not ancient exactly, but beautifully tragic in a sleepy historical way. In 1845, John Franklin led an expedition seeking the Northwest Passage. The ships disappeared completely, and Victorian Britain became obsessed. Search expeditions followed repeatedly. Maps of the Arctic evolved gradually through rescue attempts. Tiny fragments of information emerged over years. Frozen campsites, abandoned supplies, terrifyingly polite notes written by starving officers. And all of it reflected the same ancient human desire to complete the map. To remove uncertainty, even at extraordinary cost. Now, long before Franklin, Medieval and Renaissance cartographers frequently filled unknown northern regions with speculation. The Arctic especially encouraged fantasy because so few people visited it directly. One famous mapmaker, Gerardus Mercator, created remarkable polar maps containing strange geographic theories. At the North Pole, he depicted a giant black magnetic mountain surrounded by 4 enormous rivers flowing inward, which sounds less like geography and more like the introduction to a fantasy novel. Mercator based some of this on earlier accounts, including possibly lost texts describing northern voyages. And this demonstrates something important. Cartographers depended heavily on sources they could not always verify. One questionable report might influence maps for generations, especially if the report sounded scholarly enough. Human beings have always respected confident nonsense delivered formally. Now, let us float gently from frozen seas toward warmer waters and one of history's greatest cartographic misunderstandings, the idea of El Dorado, the legendary city of gold. Spanish explorers became absolutely obsessed with this. Because apparently invading one continent was insufficient, now they needed imaginary treasure cities too. Stories circulated about wealthy kingdoms hidden deep in South America, gold-covered rulers, vast riches, lost civilizations, and maps began including speculative lakes, cities, and regions associated with these legends. One famous example was Lake Piri, a huge lake appearing on European maps of South America for centuries despite not existing. It often accompanied references to El Dorado. Expeditions searched repeatedly. Men suffered horribly in jungles. And the lake persisted stubbornly in cartography long after doubts emerged. Again, once an idea enters maps, removing it becomes surprisingly difficult. Maps possess authority psychologically. If something appears in an atlas, people trust it, even if the atlas also contains decorative mermaids nearby. Now, perhaps the most wonderfully strange thing about old maps is how they blend ambition with vulnerability. These mapmakers genuinely wanted to understand the world, and they often worked under brutal limitations. No satellite imagery, no aerial photography, no instant communication, just scattered observations arriving slowly through trade networks and ship logs. And yet they attempted global representation anyway. A deeply optimistic project when you think about it, especially considering many explorers themselves barely understood where they had been. Take early Pacific exploration. The Pacific Ocean is enormous beyond normal human comprehension. Sailors crossed weeks and months of open water with limited navigational precision. Islands appeared unexpectedly. Distances became distorted. Coordinates drifted. Some islands were rediscovered repeatedly under different names because explorers failed to realize previous Europeans had already encountered them. Humanity has always enjoyed accidental duplication. Now, interestingly, Polynesian navigators managed extraordinary oceanic voyages long before Europeans entered the Pacific extensively. Using stars, currents, wave patterns, bird behavior, their navigational knowledge was astonishingly sophisticated. And this is another important reminder that cartographic history is global. European maps often dominate discussions because surviving archives became influential internationally. But many cultures developed rich geographical traditions. Chinese cartography, Islamic geography, Polynesian navigation, Indian Ocean trade mapping. Knowledge emerged everywhere humans traveled, which was almost everywhere, eventually. Now, speaking of China, one enduring cartographic mystery involves the voyages of Zheng He during the early 15th century. Zheng He commanded massive Ming treasure fleets across the Indian Ocean. Enormous expeditions, diplomatic missions mixed with imperial flexing. Because empires love dramatic displays of logistical capability. Some later speculative writers claim Chinese fleets reached the Americas before Europeans. These theories became extremely popular in certain circles. Again, because humans adore revisionist historical surprises. But mainstream historians remain unconvinced. Evidence for Chinese-American contact before Columbus is extremely weak. Still, the fascination persists because unexplained maps encourage enormous speculation. A strange coastline here, an unusual notation there. Suddenly somebody is proposing transoceanic secret empires. Now, to be fair, ancient long-distance contact between cultures did happen more often than older historians once assumed. Trade networks connected vast regions. Ideas traveled remarkably far. But extraordinary global mapping still required cumulative infrastructure and repeated observation. Not magical hidden knowledge. Usually just generations of sailors slowly improving records while trying not to drown. Which honestly makes the achievement more admirable. Now perhaps the deepest emotional appeal of mysterious maps lies in their incompleteness. Modern maps feel finished. Ancient maps feel alive. Still changing. Still uncertain. A coastline fades into blank parchment. A note warns of unknown waters. A sea monster curls lazily beside an unfinished shore, and you can almost feel the anxiety underneath. Because unexplored places frighten people. Not always dramatically. Sometimes quietly. Unknown currents. Hidden reefs. Foreign powers. Maps were attempts to reduce fear. To transform dangerous uncertainty into lines and labels. And sometimes they succeeded beautifully. Other times they accidentally invented islands for 300 years. History is a process. Now, as another royal cartographer carefully copies coastlines by candlelight, and another exhausted explorer swears he saw land somewhere west of nowhere, we continue drifting onward through humanity's long struggle to describe the planet. A struggle involving brilliance, imagination, stubbornness, and a truly heroic amount of incorrect information. Stories circulated about wealthy kingdoms hidden deep in South America. Gold-covered rulers, vast riches, lost civilizations, and maps began including speculative lakes, cities, and regions associated with these legends. One famous example was Lake Piri, a huge lake appearing on European maps of South America for centuries despite not existing. It often accompanied references to El Dorado. Expeditions searched repeatedly. Men suffered horribly in jungles. And the lake persisted stubbornly in cartography long after doubts emerged. Again, once an idea enters maps, Removing it becomes surprisingly difficult. Maps possess authority psychologically. If something appears in an atlas, people trust it, even if the atlas also contains decorative mermaids nearby. Now, perhaps the most wonderfully strange thing about old maps is how they blend ambition with vulnerability. These map makers genuinely wanted to understand the world, and they often worked under brutal limitations. No satellite imagery, no aerial photography, no instant communication. Just scattered observations arriving slowly through trade networks and ship logs. And yet they attempted global representation anyway. A deeply optimistic project when you think about it, especially considering many explorers themselves barely understood where they had been. Take early Pacific exploration. The Pacific Ocean is enormous beyond normal human comprehension. Sailors crossed weeks and months of open water with limited navigational precision. Islands appeared unexpectedly. Distances became distorted. Coordinates drifted. Some islands were rediscovered repeatedly under different names because explorers failed to realize previous Europeans had already encountered them. Humanity has always enjoyed accidental duplication. Now, interestingly, Polynesian navigators managed extraordinary oceanic voyages long before Europeans entered the Pacific extensively, using stars, currents, wave patterns, bird behavior. Their navigational knowledge was astonishingly sophisticated. And this is another important reminder that cartographic history is global. European maps often dominate discussions because surviving archives became influential internationally. But many cultures developed rich geographical traditions. Chinese cartography, Islamic geography, Polynesian navigation, Indian Ocean trade mapping. Knowledge emerged everywhere humans traveled, which was almost everywhere, eventually. Now, speaking of China, one enduring cartographic mystery involves the voyages of Zheng He during the early 15th century. Zheng He commanded massive Ming treasure fleets across the Indian Ocean. Enormous expeditions, diplomatic missions mixed with imperial flexing. Because empires love dramatic displays of logistical capability. Some later speculative writers claimed Chinese fleets reached the Americas before Europeans. These theories became extremely popular in certain circles. Again, because humans adore revisionist historical surprises. But mainstream historians remain unconvinced. Evidence for Chinese-American contact before Columbus is extremely weak. Still, the fascination persists because unexplained maps encourage enormous speculation. A strange coastline here, an unusual notation there. Suddenly somebody is proposing transoceanic secret empires. Now, to be fair, ancient long-distance contact between cultures did happen more often than older historians once assumed. Trade networks connected vast regions. Ideas traveled remarkably far. But extraordinary global mapping still required cumulative infrastructure and repeated observation. Not magical, hidden knowledge. Usually just generations of sailors slowly improving records while trying not to drown, which honestly makes the achievement more admirable. Now, perhaps the deepest emotional appeal of mysterious maps lies in their incompleteness. Modern maps feel finished. Ancient maps feel alive. Still changing. Still uncertain. A coastline fades into blank parchment. A note warns of unknown waters. A sea monster curls lazily beside an unfinished shore. And you can almost feel the anxiety underneath. because unexplored places frighten people, not always dramatically, sometimes quietly. Unknown currents, hidden reefs, foreign powers. Maps were attempts to reduce fear, to transform dangerous uncertainty into lines and labels. And sometimes they succeeded beautifully. Other times they accidentally invented islands for 300 years. History is a process. Now, as another royal cartographer carefully copies coastlines by candlelight, and another exhausted explorer swears he saw land somewhere west of nowhere, we continue drifting onward through humanity's long struggle to describe the planet. A struggle involving brilliance, imagination, stubbornness, and a truly heroic amount of incorrect information. The night grows quieter now. The sea outside our imaginary ship has become dark and glassy. Somewhere below deck, a sailor is snoring softly beside a barrel of questionable cabbage, while a navigator mutters at the stars like they personally offended him. And back on land, in Camelot monasteries and royal workshops, mapmakers continue trying to organize the world with ink, rulers, theology, rumors, and occasional artistic panic. Tonight we continue our long, sleepy drift through unexplained ancient maps. And to understand why these maps became so strange, so beautiful, and so wonderfully confusing, we need to spend a little time with medieval monks. Because monks copied everything: religious texts, classical manuscripts, scientific works, geographical ideas. Entire civilizations survived partly because tired monks in cold rooms kept rewriting books by hand for centuries. An unbelievably patient hobby. And among the texts they preserved were ancient geographical traditions inherited from Greek and Roman scholars. Now, medieval Europe often gets unfairly portrayed as intellectually empty, as though everyone spent 1,000 years staring blankly into soup. But medieval scholars were genuinely curious about the world. They debated astronomy, geography, theology, natural philosophy. Their conclusions were not always correct, naturally. But then again, modern people once believed low-fat yogurt would save civilization, so perhaps humility is appropriate. Now, many medieval maps were not designed primarily for navigation. This is important. They were visual summaries of knowledge, belief, and cosmic order. And perhaps the most famous style was the TNO map, a wonderfully simple world map design. Imagine a circle representing the known world, divided into 3 parts by a T-shape. Asia at the top, Europe bottom left, Africa bottom right, Jerusalem often placed near the center.
Neat.
Symbolic, theologically satisfying, scientifically limited, perhaps, but aesthetically calm. These maps were not attempting GPS precision. They were trying to express a worldview, the world as understood spiritually and culturally. And honestly, modern people do something similar constantly. We also map our beliefs onto reality. We just use social media instead of illuminated manuscripts. Now, one particularly extraordinary medieval map is the Hereford Mappamundi. Created around 1300, it is enormous, intricate, and slightly overwhelming in the best possible way. Looking at it feels like entering someone else's dream. Biblical scenes appear beside cities. Monsters roam distant lands. Classical references, mingle with Christian symbolism. And somewhere in the middle of everything sits Jerusalem, radiating significance. Because medieval geography was deeply tied to sacred history. Maps were moral landscapes as much as physical ones. Paradise itself sometimes appeared on maps, usually somewhere in the east, which must have been disappointing for medieval travelers who kept arriving in muddy ports instead. Now, one thing modern viewers notice immediately about medieval maps is the monsters. The monsters are everywhere. Dog-headed people, cyclopes, Blemmy with faces in their chests. Honestly, medieval cartographers were having an incredible time creatively. Now, did educated people literally believe all these creatures existed? Sometimes, perhaps. Sometimes not entirely. Ancient and medieval writers inherited monster traditions from classical sources like Pliny the Elder. Exotic lands became associated with marvelous beings partly because distant places naturally accumulated myths. If nobody from your village has ever visited India, then stories about India become increasingly imaginative very quickly. And travelers exaggerated constantly. A tale told in one port became stranger in the next. By the time it reached a monastery in Northern Europe, an unusually tall foreign merchant had transformed into a race of giants living beside rivers of gold. Human beings are remarkably efficient rumor machines. Now, interestingly, monsters on maps also served symbolic purposes. They marked danger, otherness, the unknown, a warning at the edge of certainty. And in fairness, unexplored regions genuinely were dangerous for medieval travelers. Disease, storms, bandits, political instability. The map monsters were often less terrifying than reality. Now, while monks copied symbolic maps in Europe, the Islamic world preserved and expanded geographical knowledge enormously. And this part of the story is deeply important because much classical learning survived through Arabic scholarship. Islamic scholars translated Greek works, studied astronomy, improved mathematics, and developed sophisticated geographical traditions. One major figure was Muhammad al-Idrisi, a 12th century scholar who created one of the most remarkable medieval world maps. Al-Idrisi worked for the Norman King Roger II of Sicily and Palermo, which already tells you something fascinating about the medieval Mediterranean. Cultures overlapped constantly. Muslim scholars, Christian rulers, Jewish merchants, Greek traditions. Knowledge crossed political boundaries more often than people imagine. Now, al-Idrisi's geography was astonishingly advanced for its time. He gathered information from travelers, merchants, sailors, and earlier texts. His world map and accompanying geographical work described regions across Europe, Asia, and Africa with impressive detail. And unlike some symbolic medieval maps, al-Idrisi focused heavily on practical geography, trade routes, cities, distances, real-world information for real-world movement, which was useful because merchants generally preferred accurate coastlines over decorative sea serpents, though perhaps both together would have been ideal. Now, another strange feature of ancient maps involved paradise. Literal paradise. The Garden of Eden frequently appeared on medieval maps as an actual geographical location, usually in the east. sometimes surrounded by walls or rivers, because theology and geography remained intertwined. People wanted sacred history anchored physically in the world. And this blending of spiritual meaning with physical mapping continued for centuries. Even explorers searching for new routes often understood their journeys through religious frameworks. Columbus himself believed he was participating in divine history, which becomes slightly alarming when combined with his talent for geographical miscalculation. Now, speaking of Columbus, let us drift gently toward one of the most misunderstood aspects of early exploration maps: scale. Ancient and medieval mapmakers struggled enormously with distance, especially longitude. Latitude could be estimated using celestial observations. Longitude was the true nightmare. Without precise timekeeping, east-west positioning remained deeply difficult at sea. And because of this, maps frequently stretched or compressed regions dramatically. Asia often appeared too large, oceans too small. Columbus underestimated Earth's circumference partly because he relied on incorrect calculations and optimistic assumptions, an unfortunate combination historically. If the Americas had not existed, his voyage would likely have failed catastrophically, which is an unsettling thought. History occasionally turns on accidents and incorrect math. Now, another beautiful cartographic mystery involves lost maps themselves, because countless ancient maps vanished completely, destroyed by war, fire, moisture, neglect. Libraries burned constantly throughout history, sometimes accidentally, sometimes deliberately. Human civilization has always had a difficult relationship with preserving things. And because so many original maps disappeared, later scholars often relied on copies of copies of copies, each generation introducing small changes. Errors accumulated quietly. Place names shifted. Coastlines drifted. Annotations vanished. A map became less a fixed object and more a living tradition evolving over time, which explains why certain phantom islands survived for centuries. Once embedded in copying traditions, mistakes became strangely immortal. Now, perhaps no place better illustrates humanity's cartographic confusion than the source of the Nile River. For centuries, people argued endlessly about where the Nile began. Ancient geographers proposed theories. Medieval scholars debated possibilities. Maps showed lakes, mountains, speculative river systems. The Nile fascinated people because Egypt fascinated people. And Egypt fascinated people because it was ancient even by ancient standards. Nothing impresses humans quite like realizing another civilization was already old thousands of years ago. Eventually, European explorers in the 19th century searched obsessively for the Nile's source. The expeditions became physically miserable almost immediately. Disease, climate, logistical chaos. Exploration sounds glamorous until one reads actual expedition journals. Mostly it involves suffering politely in difficult hats. Now, let us gently float toward another cartographic curiosity: maps that deliberately lied. Because yes, some maps intentionally contained false information. Governments protected secrets. Cartographers inserted trap streets or fictional details to catch plagiarists later. Even modern maps occasionally included deliberate tiny errors for copyright purposes, which means humanity's relationship with maps has always involved a slight trust issue. And during the Cold War, Soviet maps became famously strange. Some highly detailed military maps intentionally distorted civilian information. Roads shifted. Locations altered. The ancient tradition of confusing people geographically continued proudly into the modern age. Now returning softly to medieval maps, one of the most touching things about them is their emotional honesty. They openly display uncertainty. Unknown regions fade into decoration or speculation. Mapmakers admitted, in their own way, that the world exceeded their knowledge. Modern maps pretend certainty everywhere. Ancient maps often whisper uncertainty gently from the margins. Here be dragons. Or perhaps simply, we are not entirely sure what happens after this coastline, which is refreshingly humble. Now, naturally, humans still wanted certainty desperately. Rulers funded expeditions. Merchants sponsored voyages. Empires chased new routes. Every new coastline promised wealth or power. And maps became increasingly detailed as information accumulated. But even as scientific cartography improved, mystery never fully disappeared. Some islands remained elusive, some coastlines contradictory, and strange stories persisted stubbornly. Because the world itself is messy, reality rarely organizes itself neatly for cartographers. Now, perhaps the greatest irony of ancient maps is this. The inaccuracies are what make them human. A perfect satellite map contains information. An imperfect medieval map contains personality,
fear, hope,
myth, ambition. A monk imagining paradise in the east. A sailor exaggerating an island sighting. A royal geographer trying desperately to impress a king who cannot read latitude anyway. Human beings reaching outward toward the unknown. And as another weary scribe bends over parchment in the cold silence of a monastery, carefully sketching rivers he will never personally see, we drift onward once more through the unfinished geography of the past. Toward vanished libraries, impossible voyages, and civilizations quietly trying to understand a world still much larger than their maps.